What an absolute treat I have in store for all of you. I think I'm loving this more than anyone else, really. Calicast has spoken to Greg Kading, the former LAPD investigations officer of the Biggie Smalls murder case. It was an unbelievable hour, and one of the highlights of my kind of media career, I think. We spoke about everyone from Puff Daddy to Suge Knight, his involvement, Tupac, Biggie, obviously, Voletta Wallace, and the alleged killers that Greg Kading believes are the dead certain killers. Poochie for Biggie, Orlando Anderson for Tupac, and everyone from Keefe D to the entourage of both crews and record labels as well. It was an insane hour. I was shook, still am shook, but it was unbelievable to speak to him and fantastic to kind of get his insight. So I hope you all enjoy it as much as I did speaking to him. Get following, get sharing, get liking, get commenting. Just get watching and listening to it and take it all in. Enjoy.
They just can never get enough of Biggie and Tupac, I guess.
Do you have, how much kind of questions do you have on a daily basis then? Is it a case of you get people coming up to you in the street?
No, it's usually through social media and the internet. I don't get really hit up on the street like that. But it is every single day. You know, last night Fox News was over here interviewing me about some new documentary that Puffy is producing called I have a story to tell. It's based on the life of Biggie, and then I'm it just is every day.
Do you ever get tired of it?
I don't get tired of it. I feel like it's an obligation or a responsibility. You know, I work the case, so I have an obligation to share the information that is of public interest. But I do get tired of the bullshit because there's just a lot of really narrow-minded people out there that just don't want to accept the facts for what they are, and they're just typically young people that don't understand the importance of logic and evidence and facts. But that's the only thing that frustrates me. And I shouldn't be frustrated. I should just accept it for what it is. But every once in a while, you just get somebody who's just ugly, and you just have to ignore them.
Yeah, I mean, like from what I've kind of read, researched, watched, as much as I can over the course of 10, 15, 20 years of obviously following hip hop, you kind of make, obviously, I think it's like you say, it goes with age as well. You make your kind of opinions and assumptions and you dig a little bit deeper. And then you realise actually what I've believed for maybe a couple of years or whatever it may be isn't actually the case. And obviously, I've seen many interviews with yourself over the years, and you've always been so concrete with your, affirmations and your conclusions that what you came to is exactly how it was. And has there ever been any doubt in your mind that you with your team ever got it wrong, or there's an element of questioning in any aspects of your investigation?
No, actually, I was 100% confident back in 2010, when I retired and just prior to writing my book. I was absolutely confident that we had gotten to the bottom, we've gotten to the truth behind both Tupac and Biggie's murder. And then actually, my confidence, if you can even grow beyond 100%, continued to increase, because afterwards I started to get more and more affirmations from different people that weren't willing to come forward on their own or publicly, but people that were there from the Southside Crips and people that were behind the scenes at the Mob Pyru and Death Row. And so I just got more and more substantiation that what I was saying was true. So it actually increased the probabilities to 1,000-fold instead of 100%.
Okay, cool. And obviously going back to you being on the case and from the very start, how did you feel at that time? Being, because obviously you were given the case, and I've read a few interviews where you said you felt quite overwhelmed with the information that was presented to you previously by Russell Poole. How did you feel kind of being at the centre of probably one of, if not the biggest case in, LAPD history?
Well, keep in mind, so I wasn't just a man on an island. I was among a whole group of people that were uh, assigned the responsibility of this case. So I shared this whole pressure and responsibility with a multitude of other people from, not only LAPD, but different agencies. And so we all took our own little areas of response. We all collectively worked together, but it was a shared responsibility. It wasn't Greg Kading out there trying to solve the world's problems.
Yeah, okay. And in terms of, obviously you've been retired about 10, 11 years now from what I've seen. Do you have any element of frustration, Greg, with, because as far as you're aware, the case was solved in terms of who killed Tupac, who killed Biggie, but obviously that couldn't go to its full fruition. Do you have an element of frustration looking back now in terms of what could have been, or are you kind of happy with how much you did at the time?
Well, obviously, hindsight is 2020. If, I think that there's things that could have been done better, but I also recognize there's no such thing as a perfect investigation. There's always going to be mistakes made. Sometimes they're major, sometimes they're minor, but there's no such thing as a perfect investigation. Things get overlooked. And also, I understand and sympathize or empathize with the frustration of the original investigators, both in Las Vegas and in LA, where they really wanted to solve the case, but nobody was cooperating with them. None of the people that were in positions to help make the case happen were coming forward and helping, really. So I'm frustrated for that, is that they should have been solved. They could have been solved if everybody had done the right thing.
Yeah. And is this the most exciting case that you had in your career, Greg?
It's definitely it has the most notoriety and has had the most kind of continuous interest and involvement. So yeah, I think so. I mean, it was a real privilege to work on the cases. It's unfortunately that two, young men had to die. It's terrible. But if they did, I'm glad, since they did, I should say, I'm glad I had an opportunity to be involved in their investigations. Yeah.
Because obviously your focus in your career was always kind of gang culture and gang related. You worked on about 200 cases before this.
It had always been, ever since I got on the LAPD, I was always interested in the gang culture, gang investigations, and just how gangs operate. So from the day I started in South Central Los Angeles until the day I retired, almost everything I did was either, gang related, narcotic related, or both. The majority of homicides in Los Angeles are either gang or narcotic related. And so, yeah, that was always my area of interest and probably my area of expertise.
It must have been amazing to work on those cases in terms of the element of adrenaline every single day, pushing you towards finishing, whichever case you were working on. And that kind of almost like living on the edge in terms of danger, in terms of obviously South Central.
Yeah, it's a weird thing. From an outsider's perspective, I would see how you would perceive, well, that's a dangerous environment. But when you're the police, you don't go to work feeling afraid of what's going to happen that day or who you're going to encounter. As a law enforcement officer, you always feel like you're kind of in a position of advantage. You've got resources that most of, the people that you're dealing with don't. And so there was never a fear factor ever for me. In fact, a lot of the times it was just fun. There was just a lot of fun out there on the streets, chasing people down alleys and being in pursuits with cars. I mean, that stuff's a blast. It's exciting. It really is. So fear was never a component in my career.
And that's kind of obviously gone on to the Biggie and Tupac case. That you've been asked the question before about whether you've ever had any kind of potential death threats, and you've never had anything like that, have you?
I've had death threats, but I didn't really take them seriously. I recently had one online. I just reported to the FBI and let them run with whatever, investigation they could do. But no, I mean, I'm not a hard guy to find, but if you do find me and you have bad intentions, you got to understand that I'm always prepared to protect myself. And so I don't look over my shoulder or look out my windows or anything like that. And also there's this other interesting thing that I don't think people fully appreciate. I'm just a guy out there conducting an investigation. I'm just a guy out there doing my job. in revealing the information that we discovered through that process, people don't really have an issue with me. What people have issues with is informants, or with people who lie on them, or people who misrepresent what they did or done. And so really, if you're out there trying to honestly do your job right, nobody should really have an issue with you.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And in the case itself, obviously you've mentioned, your frustrations, maybe looking back towards obviously the, Las Vegas police and LAPD. I'm very confident in your, assertion of the case. Were there any other different avenues, pieces of evidence, people you spoke to that you kind of explored, that you were thinking, this is the direction we want to go down? And did you ever kind of get waylaid from your, directive conclusion in the end, or was there other ideas that you explored?
Oh, I got you. Yeah, absolutely. No, we went into this with an absolutely open mind. We were going to take all the plausible theories and investigate them. We were going to look into everything. That was, that's the only way you can come to that's the only way you can kind of reach a definitive conclusion, is to explore all the possibilities. And that's what we did. But as we continued to disprove things, then it narrowed and filtered down to the one thing we couldn't disprove, which is usually the truth. And so what ended up happening is we got to a place where we're really confident. The only thing, and I'll tell you this, the only thing that I still have an open question about is the night that Poochie was at the Peterson Auto Museum, and he shot and killed Biggie. I don't know if he was completely acting alone. There's always room that there was a spotter, somebody out there who was reporting to him exact location of where Biggie was in the car. So I'm open-minded to the possibility that there was another suspect that we haven't identified yet. But I'm absolutely positive that Poochie was the killer, as far as the shooting.
It's quite fascinating in terms of, I mean, like you say, Greg, it's going to go on for years and years, this case, in terms of people talking about it and conspiracy theories. But even just when I was doing my research, discussing it with yourself, it's quite fascinating to think there is people still out there that could have realms of information and evidence that are just carrying on with their normal day-to-day lives, but could have helped the case even further now, 20, 30 years ago. And it, you know what I mean? Just they can carry on and kind of carry that. I just find it quite interesting that they're almost like carrying around history, aren't they? Like hip-hop history. I think in terms of, obviously, because Keefe D, he only came, I think it's about 2 or 3 years, and in the last 2 or 3 years, he kind of admitted the killing, didn't he? And when I read that news, and obviously I've heard you say this a few times yourself, it's almost like, how can he not be charged? But obviously it's due to the proffer agreement, isn't it?
Well, kind of. So originally, his confession was 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So when his confession came in, yes, what he confessed to, we could not use against him. It didn't mean he had immunity. We just couldn't take his self-incriminating statements and use those to prosecute him. So, and then years later, he came out and he began to publicly state his involvement in Tupac's murder. He went on the Gangster Chronicles on BET. He wrote a book. And so he's been very, public about his involvement. None of those statements are protected and can be used to prosecute him. However, you run into this kind of technicality with a prosecution, is your defendant's only witness is against himself.
Yeah.
So how do you prosecute a guy when he's the only guy that can actually testify to his own involvement? So that is a technicality that keeps this case from being filed or prosecuted. It's just the way it is. Yeah, that's my answer to that.
Yeah. How do you feel about that, though? Are you frustrated that he's still kind of obviously declaring this as he did this?
And, I believe very strongly in karma. We've seen karma play a role in both of these investigations throughout the years. And so I trust in divine justice. And Keefe D will be held accountable in some way, shape, or form. However, it's not the one that we all would hope to see, which is him going to jail for his involvement in Tupac's murder. But that being said, what I'm frustrated with is that the police departments won't just close the cases, because Las Vegas PD knows that Keefe D's statements are valid and accurate. they should just close the case, regardless of whether you can prosecute it, because history should demand that these guys' case are closed, they're solved, and history should recognize that. Same with LAPD, with Biggie. But because of bureaucracy and the bullshit that takes place at the top levels of these departments, that's probably never going to get done.
Yeah, it's like, obviously it's absolutely crazy that hasn't happened. Obviously, from your perspective, being completely central to the case, but from an outsider who's followed the case and the murders for years. I remember when the story came out, I couldn't really, because you piece it together, you watch the documentaries that the stories, the articles that come out, and you piece it together and make up your own mind. But when he came out and said it all made sense, didn't it? And it's just mental that it can't be almost prosecuted. But I think from what I've read, he's dying from cancer, isn't he? So he's probably going to give one way or another. He's going to go.
Yeah, so he claims that he had cancer. I don't know if it was terminal cancer. I mean, this was years ago that he made these claims about having nothing else to live. Nothing was keeping him from doing what he was doing. But, here he is years later, still alive. So I don't know how serious his condition is. But, when he confessed, his nephew, Orlando Anderson, had been dead for years, almost, 11 years. His nephew had been dead. So, you've got the primary shooter gone. Ultimately, the other witness in the back seat, DeAndre Smith, he died. Terrence Brown, he's dead. He was the driver of the white Cadillac in Las Vegas. So Keefe D is kind of a Zip, the guy who gave Keefe D the gun, which was used to kill Tupac. He's dead. So you got all these missing elements. And so Keefe D is kind of like the last man standing insofar as the direct perpetrators of Tupac's murder. And so it's hard to prosecute when you don't have other co-conspirators or witnesses that are willing to point the finger at him. So, time has not been favorable to either of these cases.
Did you find that quite hard when you picked up the case in 2006 then? Because obviously it was 9 years on, which is obviously quite a considerable amount of time anyway. How did you find that?
Well, keep in mind, it wasn't just a cold case insofar as the amount of work that was being done to further the investigation. It was also a case that was embroiled in this big civil lawsuit. So it had all these political and ramifications that we were having to try to work around. And so that made it a little bit difficult just because of the technicalities involved with a civil case while there's an ongoing criminal investigation. So we had to balance all of that. But we were overwhelmed at first with the amount of work that actually had been done. And then we narrowed it down to the theories that were most likely. And then we just started to explore those. So it was a lot of work, but, once we had a great team, we had really good guys working on it. Me and my partner, Darren, we were really close. And then there was a dozen other people that were all lending their help and resources. So it was a great collaboration of people working on the case.
Yeah. Was there any part of you that kind of wished you hadn't taken it on at the time? I mean, were you a bit kind of fearful of the size of it, or were you happy to embrace the challenge?
I have no regrets whatsoever. I was happy to embrace the challenge. I'm happy we got to where we got. But I do sometimes, if I'm honest with you, wondering, like, what if I never had done that case? Well, what would the rest of my career with LAPD maybe been like? What would I have continued to work longer? And if I did, what would so there's a lot of what ifs, but definitely no regrets.
Was it quite strange for you then, Greg, being part of this case and kind of almost getting recognised as being the face of the case, even though obviously there was a team of you? Have you found that kind of strange over the last 10, 15 years? Or do you ever get used to it?
I don't know. It's kind of funny sometimes, even
me reaching out to you, and you're like a lad from England that you have no idea, me and you've never met before, but the fact that, I saw you on the Cecil Hotel documentary, and I know who you are, and I thought, I'll message you and see how we get on, and just to have a conversation, because this, it's unbelievable to be having a conversation with you. But from your perspective, you're like, you must be like, who's this guy out of nowhere, like, messaging me, when they're talking about Biggie and Tupac?
I'll tell you, I think that that's one of the greatest blessings as a result of this whole thing is I've just met a bunch of really, really wonderful people, and I've got to travel and go places that I may not otherwise have gone. And I've just met really great people and people that are curious about the case, and they're just genuinely nice people to know. So that's been a great blessing. And then and then there's this other component. It's not just the strangers that I build, friendships with.
Yeah.
It's people that I haven't talked to from like high school, 40 years ago, that all of a sudden are reconnecting to me on Facebook. Hey, Greg, I haven't talked to you since, 10th grade. How's it going? I saw you on some show. And then you reconnect with these people that, you used to have a place in your life for. So it's really kind of cool.
Yeah, it must be quite mad as well. I couldn't really kind of comprehend what you've been through, Greg, over the last 2 or 3 decades. It just must be unreal to be recognised from people all across the globe, really. But yeah, I'm sure you get mad fanatics like myself who just love hip hop and just want to know everything there is about the kind of music and the behind the scenes, facts and figures that took place. Yeah, but I mean, carry on.
I've learned so much. I've learned so much about things that I would never have otherwise had any involvement in or an opportunity to learn about, like, just production and being involved in television, or, all of these things that have been great learning experiences. It's been a kind of a new chapter in life that has been very exciting. And I'll tell you what other thing is that's interesting is how diverse the hip hop community is. Coming into this, I'll just be honest with you, I always kind of thought about hip hop, and especially rap, being part of a real subculture. And then I found out that, man, there's 60-year-old men that are in, corporate executives who are listening to Tupac and asking about what happened in Biggie, and how diverse the hip hop community is on a global scale. Like, I would never have had an appreciation for that if I had not gotten involved in this case and in the aftermath of the case.
Yeah. So you didn't know too much about hip hop, did you, when you first started the case?
No, not at all. I grew up on classic rock and roll, and I came up in a middle class environment, and I didn't have a lot of insight into what was happening on the streets of urban society until I became a police officer. And so I didn't have that experience as a young man with hip hop music and its culture.
What were your first thoughts then when you were on the case and you were dealing with the high profile people you were dealing with? What were you thinking at the time? This is, going to be quite cut and dry.
Well, I knew, again, I come from, when you say high profile people, you mean people like Suge Knight?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Tupac and Biggie in terms of themselves as artists, but then dealing with Suge Knight, Puff Daddy, their whole entourage, is Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg.
Yeah, well, we always knew that we were going to have our hands full. It was going to be a very difficult obstacle to overcome, is to break that barrier of the street code, which is, don't engage with law enforcement if you can avoid it. Don't cooperate with law enforcement if you can avoid it, and just, keep your mouth shut, because that's typically what's in your best interest to do. And we knew that was going to be a really difficult thing, is to bridge that gap. And so, and we also knew, we always knew that there was going to be a gang component to this, right? There was never really any doubt. We knew that the people associating with Bad Boy and the people associating at Death Row were gangsters from the streets of Compton. And that was always going to be a common denominator. And as a gang investigator, you know how difficult sometimes it is to break through that threshold of silence.
Yeah. And with Suge Knight himself, you never got to interview him, did you?
We never interviewed him. We did tons of surveillance on him, and of course, we already knew Suge Knight had been interviewed on multiple occasions prior to our task force, since we already knew what his approach was going to be, which is either to lie and feed you just some Suge Knight-isms. He publicly said, it's not my job to solve these murders, and I'll never talk to the police. So we knew that going in. So we needed to figure out another way to corner him. And then, it didn't work out so much, and he was never going to come clean. He was never going to be a guy that sits in front of a detective and spills his beans.
Would you have loved to have had the chance to speak to him?
Oh, heck yeah. I would today. Yeah, I'd love to. Let's get on a Zoom meeting from prison. I would love to talk to him, because you know what? That's a different thing, is a lot of people are intimidated by Suge Knight. And so they'll engage with him, but in a very colloquial way. I wouldn't. If I were going to talk to Suge Knight, I would be respectful, but I'm not going to let him get away with any bullshit. I'm going to be very direct. I'm going to pin him down to answers. And most people are too intimidated by him to really press that hard. And that's unfortunate, because he needs to be held accountable for his involvement in a multitude of things. So I would love to. I would love to be the guy that sits in front of him and says, let's get down to business.
And he'd probably kind of respect you for that, to be that direct, I'm guessing. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know how he'd respond to it. He's up there in age. Maybe he's matured a little bit. Maybe he's gotten a lot of the violent responses out of his nature. I don't know.
Do you think everything that's been kind of written and said about him is as true as?
Oh, absolutely. There's just too many credible accounts of his involvement in things. Whether it's beating people up at the studio and pistol whipping people, whether it's, creating conflict to where, individuals are shooting each other because of things that Suge Knight has done and said, or, whether he's running over people in the parking lot of a hamburger stand. Suge Knight creates and causes a lot of drama that ends up getting people hurt.
Yeah. And did you ever have to kind of interview Dr. Dre or Snoop Dogg?
No, they were both interviewed by law enforcement prior to my involvement. So I had the benefit of knowing exactly what they said during their law enforcement interviews, both Andre and Calvin.
Yeah.
Dr. Dre and Snoop. So I had all of their interview statements, and we knew that they were not involved in any way, shape, or form in either of these investigations insofar as the murders. So they're kind of ancillary to what we're trying to accomplish. Snoop he wasn't involved, so therefore he's just kind of at best a hearsay witness. So those guys are interesting to talk to just because of who they are and what their background might be. But so as far as the murder, they weren't people of interest.
Okay. Did you have much to do with Frank Alexander? And obviously Tupac's bodyguard, and the kind of mysterious kind of circumstances how he died?
Yeah, I knew Frank to some degree. I wouldn't say that we were friends, but I certainly would say that we had a limited history together. Frank used to be a custodian at the jail in Orange County. I was a deputy sheriff at that jail. So I knew of Frank as far as his employment with the county as a custodian in the jail. I found out later that he was misrepresenting himself as an actual cop, telling people that he was a law enforcement official when he wasn't. He just happened to work for a law enforcement agency as a civilian. And he also was really close friends with my sister. So my sister and Frank were both amateur bodybuilders, and they used to train together. And so Frank would oftentimes have conversations with my sister and vice versa. And so I was aware of Frank's relationship, obviously, with my own sister and their history. And then as I got into the investigation of Tupac's murder, I was also aware of all the lies that Frank was telling. And I understand the motive of his lies. He was trying to protect Tupac. But at the same time, those lies misled investigators, and it wasn't in the best interest of solving the crime. So Frank had a lot of his own demons. He was very narcissistic, very much about Frank and his image. And Unfortunately, his own life's decisions caught up with him, and that's when he decided that he was done living, and either accidentally was, put a gun to his head, pulled the trigger, or intentionally put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. His wife was home when it happened, and he may have just been like, he may have just been going through this motion, like trying to scare her or make a point. But Frank had a history of firearms. Frank should have known that the gun was loaded if it was an accident or it was intentional. But it was one of the two. It was either an accident or intentional. It certainly wasn't any nefarious activities.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've read before that kind of Suge Knight potentially was involved. It's conspiracy, I'm guessing.
It's all bullshit.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad you cleared that up for me, Greg.
Yeah, I'll tell you exactly what happened real quick. What happened was after Suge Knight went to jail after his involvement in the beatdown of Orlando Anderson in Las Vegas. And then, of course, he's going to go to his probation hearing. And they wanted Frank to come and testify in that probation hearing. So Reggie Wright Jr. was trying to pressure Frank into coming and testifying on behalf of Suge. Well, Frank knew that if he went and took the stand, he was going to have to perjure himself. He was going to have to go up and either tell the truth on the stand, which means the stuff he'd already said would be shown to be lies, or vice versa. And so Frank was just like, I don't want to be involved in this because I'm going to end up looking bad. And they kept trying to pressure him. And that's when he came up with this whole thing about being threatened and blah, blah, blah. But, that was so many years before he died. And so the whole thing is just another conspiracy theory trying to weave things together to conveniently say that Suge had something to do with his death, which he didn't.
Yeah. How did you find the conspiracy theories when you were actually working on the case then? Because it must have been quite distracting and frustrating for you to actually trying to get your job done.
Well, it's necessary. You have to go down and try to answer all of those questions that get raised. And sometimes there's it's prudent to look into these things because you never know where you're going to find the next clue or the lead. So, but it's just when you've disproven a conspiracy theory and then people continue to try to promote that theory, that's when it gets frustrating because they are unwilling to recognize why this theory doesn't hold any water. But they're so committed to it that they would rather just ignore the facts and the evidence that disproves it. And psychologically, it's called confirmation bias. Like you have an idea about what happened, and then you interpret information in order to support that idea, and you kind of ignore all the information that undermines the theory. So, and this happens with cops, but it definitely happens in the public where people, for instance, they just think, oh, the police are bad, so therefore they must have been involved in Biggie's killing. And then they interpret information to support that preconceived notion. And this is just bad logic. It's bad thinking. And it's certainly bad investigative techniques.
And do you think that's what happened to Russell Poole then?
100%.
And because he was very fixated on the Amir Muhammad aspect of the investigation, and he kind of ran with that, didn't he?
He ran with it. Problem is, he dug in his heels. And when the information started to surface that this is not a good theory, Michael Robinson, the informant that was the foundation of that theory, was completely discredited. And so if you have the foundation no longer intact, you can't build anything on a broken foundation. And he just kept doing that. And that's where I think that people started to lose their respect, and it's where he lost his objectivity.
It's a shame. It's a shame what happened to him from... Yeah, I mean, you didn't cross over in the investigation, did you, Greg? Obviously, he was way before you, and then obviously you took over, and unfortunately, he kind of passed away about 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, so he wasn't on the case for that long, not even a year. And he had his own personal problems going on in life. He had his own problems going on with the department. He got frustrated and he resigned. And then, most of us know what took place after that. He kind of spiraled. And ultimately, he died of a stress-related heart attack. But we did investigate the claims. We had to. That's what the whole lawsuit was based on. The entire lawsuit was based on the theory that Russell Poole and others had promoted. And so, of course, it was necessary to find out if any of that information was reliable, and whether or not we could substantiate it, which of course we couldn't.
Yeah. So from that then, I mean, talk me through your kind of relationship with Voletta Wallace. Obviously, you shared a few kind of emotional moments together, didn't you? From what I read.
So during the investigation, just because there was a lawsuit being waged against the city, our investigation, we weren't really allowed to go out and have interaction with certain people, including the plaintiffs on the lawsuit. Because absolutely what happens is, here's the risk you run and why it's a conflict of interest, is that if we go and interview Voletta Wallace, or anybody else for that matter, we don't know how they're going to spin that interaction. And the cops came in and tried to dissuade me from this lawsuit, or they tried to, coerce me. And that just becomes more and more problematic. So from a prosecutorial standpoint or a defensive standpoint, you're like, hey, let's just avoid that possible scenario. We don't want anybody claiming that we're coercing them. We don't want anyone claiming that we're pressuring them. We don't want anybody claiming, that we're acting. So we just avoid that. So I didn't get to meet Voletta Wallace until after the lawsuit was dismissed. And that's when I went out and met with her personally. I told her what we found out in the investigation, and I built a rapport with her. I felt that she knew how genuine I was. And obviously she's just a woman of incredible grace who's been through more than any mother should ever have to endure. And I just built I knew we were always trying to solve the case for her, but until I met her, I didn't really have that special place in my heart for her. And then once that developed, I kept contact with her for years. And then now my old partner, Darren Dupree, who's still on the job, he maintains that professional relationship with her. So I just wish her the absolute best, and I hope she finds some peace through what we found.
You still speak to her kind of now, or is it kind of you're not as close as you were?
I haven't spoken to Mrs. Wallace in a couple of years. It's been a couple of years.
And is there anyone from the case, whether it's artist-wise or entourages, people that you had to come into contact with that you've ever crossed paths with after the case when you've been retired?
So with Biggie's case, the conspirators in that were really just down to three people. There was Suge's baby mama, Teresa Swan, and then Poochie. So that's why that was a hard one to crack, because the conspiracy was so small that it was, a lot of people didn't even know. And so that's one of the reasons that one was a little different. Tupac's, there was a lot of people involved. There was 4 people in the car. There was Zip, who gave him the gun. Of course, there's the association going on with the Southside Crips and Puffy. So that one was a little different. Plus, with Poochie, he's this very private guy who wasn't going around and bragging about his involvement in the murder, unlike Orlando Anderson and other people that were in the car were down in their neighborhoods, like bragging about their involvement in Tupac's murder. So completely different investigations in that sense. As far as Biggie's, who do I don't really have any connection with anybody. I talked to Amir Muhammad occasionally, who was the guy falsely accused. Harry Billups. He was then the one that was being falsely accused by Russell Poole and others. I maintained contact with him, and he's moved on. He's gone out of state and is moving on with his life. But of course, I think there's always going to be that dark cloud that he has to deal with because of those false allegations.
Interesting. And how do you find your kind of relationship with the hip hop community now? Obviously, you weren't the biggest kind of knowledge of the music. Do you embrace it now?
Oh, absolutely. I appreciate it. I don't know if I embrace it in the sense that I don't go around all day with my headphones in listening to hip hop, but I certainly have a new appreciation for like the importance of the culture of the music and the stories that are being told and the incredible talent of what it takes to produce some of that music. But then there's part of it, anything that is promotes violence or misogyny, anything that promotes anything negative in society, I have a distaste for. So if it's upbeat and it's positive and it's doing good things and good messages, then I absolutely support it and appreciate it. But if it's something that's just promoting antisocial behavior. I don't have time for that, nor an appreciation for it.
Interesting. Could you believe, Greg, kind of how complex the case was when you first came on it? I mean, have you dealt with as complex of a case as this in your previous cases?
I actually had one that was more complicated just prior to getting into the Biggie Smalls murder investigation. I was in this big racketeering case, another big task force, years-long investigation, very, very complicated, dealing with all types of different issues between immigration and public corruption and extortion and murder and bribe. It was just a very, very complicated case. But again, I was part of a multi-agency task force with 16, 20 other people. And that was a really complicated case.
How much pressure did you put on yourself when you first came into the case and you were, you in the midst of it?
I didn't really get as much pressure from my superiors or from the department as I did from myself, because that's the way I'm kind of wired. I have super high expectations of myself, and I put a lot of pressure on myself to succeed. So my internal pressure and self-inflicted stress was much more than any that the department had put on me.
I'm quite the same, Greg. Haven't dealt with the Biggie and Tupac case, but in terms of putting pressure on myself, nobody can put more pressure on myself than me. And I know exactly what you mean. It's just, but I think when you've got that kind of, you've set goals in your head to achieve what you want to achieve, there's no one else that can really tell you otherwise. And I'm guessing that's what you were doing. You wanted to go in there. I'm sure you had, your opinions of Russell Poole, his team, and you just wanted to kind of set the record straight from the work that you've done.
Yeah, well, keep in mind, there was no Russell Poole team. There was just Russell Poole. And one of the reasons that he was so frustrated is because he couldn't convince other people to see things his way. His partners didn't see things his way. The other members of robbery homicide division didn't see things, because they're all good investigators that were looking at the facts and the evidence of the case. And they recognized that the foundation of those claims that he built his theory on were completely invalid. And so I think that they were all looking at Russ like, Russ, why aren't you seeing this for the way that it really is? Why is it so important of you to patch together this theory that ultimately can't hold any water? So it was the Russell Poole factor that I think his whole thing was like this self-imposed deterioration.
It's like you say, it's a shame in terms of what happened to him. And obviously you mentioned Suge, but Puff Daddy, I mean, what's your kind of opinion on him? I know you've been very kind of vocal in what you think his prominence was in the kind of killings and the behind the scenes movements that he made. What do you think of him now?
Well, obviously he's a music maverick. He's an icon. I think that he has built himself an incredible empire based on opportunity and hard work. Those two things that you can't take away from him is the work ethic and the opportunities that he put himself in places to have opportunities. Character-wise, yeah, I think he's flawed. I think that he has some skeletons in his closet that'll probably never get revealed. And I think he lives with that guilt every day, personally. But again, and I always say this, I always give this caveat to every time that this question's raised. Puffy was in a very, very difficult and dangerous situation. He knew that Suge Knight was hunting him down. He knew that Suge Knight had people that would be more than willing to put a bullet in his back. He knew that. And so with that in mind, he wasn't going to stay behind, the closed gates of his estate in New York. He still wanted to go out and come to California and be active. And with a target on your back, you get desperate. And he made a desperate move in order to preserve himself. And that's when he aligned himself with people that he shouldn't have been aligned with. That's when he made statements that he shouldn't have said. And that's what ultimately indirectly involves him in the murder of Tupac Shakur.
It's fast. Honestly, Greg, it's absolutely fascinating. I could sit here all day and I'll let you go now. But it's been a pleasure speaking to you. I could hear you talk about it all day long.
It's been my pleasure.
I just find it fascinating because it's obviously it's music, but then it's everything that goes behind the music, and such a massive case that what kind of floors me as well is how young they were, like 24 and 25. It's absolutely nothing as an age to die. Mm-hmm. And you see them as grown men, but then you take everything away from, they're famous rappers, they've got all this money, all these talents, all this opportunity. You take all that away, they're just boys in their mid-20s, weren't they?
That's that you're absolutely right, David. They're not only just boys in their mid-20s, they're boys in their mid-20s that are in a very unique situation with the amount of money and fame and pressure and notoriety. I mean, that changes we're already stupid when we're 24 and 25. I've raised a son of my own, and I remember when I was 24 and 25 and the stupid shit I was doing, and just not having a broad enough perspective on life and enough life experience. Add to that the idea that you've got an entourage around you and you feel invincible and you've got money and your future is just anything that you want it to be. Now you've taken a kid who doesn't have the experience to navigate all of those waters, and bad things can happen. And we've seen it happen over and over in the hip hop community, haven't we?
Yeah, and it continues to keep happening, like you say. I mean, how many murders and killings has been in the last 6 months, year alone? Obviously, Nipsey Hussle. How did you find that kind of that murder, Nipsey Hussle? It's obviously, I'm sure if you were working, you would have been involved in that, right? Potentially.
I was already long retired. Yeah. My old partner Darren had some indirect involvement in that. Just because he had such a vast history of the street culture and hip hop and all of those things. But that just came down to another street action. It's very hard to be involved in. It's very difficult to be, I guess I'll say, a celebrity. I guess he would be obviously considered a celebrity, a person of influence, and still stay down in that hood where you were raised, where there's just so much violence and animosity. And, it's very difficult to live in both of those worlds at the same time. You've either got to commit to one or the other, I think, in order to protect yourself from the inherent conflict that's going to take place if you try to live in both worlds at the same time.
Yeah, it's almost like a victim of his own success, wasn't he? In terms of staying in the same environment and not kind of progressing on and moving out of that area.
Right.
Yeah, I've just got a couple more questions, Greg, about Cecil Hotel, then I'll let you have your Sunday afternoon. Because my wife was very intrigued. I was watching it, I think, last week, and I was like, I recognise him. Yeah, he's Greg Kading. And then when I obviously said to my wife, I'm speaking to you, she had a couple of questions.
Okay.
Because I mean, how much attention have you had from that in the last few weeks? I'm guessing it's just completely gone mad.
Yeah, so that became wildly popular on Netflix, and it was such a well done documentary. I was so happy to see how well done that was, because sometimes you get involved in documentaries and they're just not, whether it's a budgeting issue or something, you just aren't impressed. But this one was really, really good, and I love the way at the end they kept Elisa Lam alive by talking about the influence that she had and the positive steps that it made towards recognizing mental illness. So I was really, really happy about that. I've gotten a lot of good feedback. So I was really happy to be involved in that project.
Did you have much to do with the Cecil Hotel when you were, an active officer?
Not really. I never personally investigated any crimes there. I'd been there before, but I didn't personally investigate any crimes there. But obviously you're aware of it because it's one of several hotels in Los Angeles whose reputations precede them. This one's unique because it's right in the middle of Skid Row. And the fact that any hotel can operate in that environment is rather unique.
I didn't realise, because I've been to LA once and I was meant to go there April last year, but obviously COVID, and I didn't realise Skid Row was so big. I had no idea how big it actually was in terms of the vastness of it. And then obviously the show, the map on the Netflix doc, and
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. It's like its own little community, own little city almost within LA, isn't it?
And it just continues to expand. I mean, homeless issue in Los Angeles is so bad. It's just an absolute tragedy for everybody, you know, that they haven't figured out how to curtail this issue. All the business owners suffer, residents suffer because they have homeless basically encamped, you know, on the freeway underpasses as they leave their homes to go to work. And it's just it's a real blight on the profile of Los Angeles, and they've got to figure out a way to help get the help that these people need and get them to a place where it doesn't interfere with commerce. LA is a mess when it comes to its homeless population.
It's not all kind of glitz and glamour, is it?
Oh,
not at all.
It's horrible.
Well, Greg, thank you very much for your time. I really do appreciate it. It's been an absolute honour and pleasure.
Always, David. It's my pleasure, buddy. I appreciate you.
No, appreciate you. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll speak soon, and take care.
Okay, have a good one.
And you. See you later.